Well, thank you, and it's a privilege to be here. And before I begin, Mr. Khan, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful collaboration that has made this report possible. It's been a fun journey, and I hope this is the start, not the end. So thank you. I also wanted to say how excited I am to be here in India. I've been to India 4 times in the last year, and last year I was on record saying that I really believe this is India's century. And I stand behind that statement. Our 2047 report shows that India will grow by 8% per year between now and 2047. India will add 220 million non-farm jobs to its economy, driving inclusive growth. India will have over 60% female participation rate in the workforce by 2047. And India's per capita income, when all these are realized, will be over $20,000 per person, 10 times what it is today. Why? There's phenomenal tailwinds for India. If you think about the world's talent factory, 20% of the world's talent resides here in the working population age. When we think about supply chains, we've identified over $1 trillion of economic value as supply chains are reimagined in India. And finally, when we think about digitization, there's only over 850 million internet users in India that provide a foundation for a technological future. Maybe most exciting that all 3 of my kids reminded me of was the lunar landing. They all watched it, and as my daughter, who's in university, also pointed out, she said the total cost was less than Interstellar. And that shows something in terms of revolution, right? It's phenomenal. So I can think of no better place to start to talk about the issues that I'm about to tee up than here in India. It's India's moment, and India can lead on this dimension. Before I get into the formal launch of the report, I would also like to just perhaps share some contextual framework in terms of what's going on in the world around us. I would argue as we look at this decade and we embark on solving these challenges, there have been no time in history when the confluence of forces that we're dealing with have come together at the same time. Geopolitics is fundamentally changing. Demographics are changing at a rate that we've never seen. We talked about the North versus the South. Inequality continues to rise, and it's a topic that I will come back with. For 70% of the world's population, they live in economies with growing inequality. Climate is an issue that has to be solved now. It's not one that we can put off. And finally, the rate of pace of technological adoption is something that we've never seen before. Now, any one of these 5 issues could be a generational defining change. We have both the challenge and the opportunity to solve all 5 of these at the same time. So there's a unique context. So let me then go to today, to the launch of our report. And this report talks about 5 things, all under the banner of how do we drive a world that has sustainable, inclusive growth. This has been a personal passion of mine, and if I were to say one thing on this topic of sustainable, inclusive growth, it's how do we push back against the tyranny of or-based thinking. I'm often asked, Bob, do you stand for growth or inclusion? Do we want growth or do we want climate? Do we want climate or do we want inclusion? That's easy thinking. Right? Hard thinking embraces the challenge of the and, that says, really, this is a simultaneous equation. And if we want to solve inclusion, if we want to solve sustainability, if we want to solve growth, we have to solve all 3 at the same time. They link to each other in a synergistic way. It is not easy to solve all 3, but we believe that's possible. Today's report, done in collaboration with Mr. Khan and others, lays a critical foundational pillar to start to lay the fact base that this is possible. And we have 5 important observations that I'd like to share with you. The first observation goes to a notion of redefining the floor from poverty to empowerment. Let's change our thinking from a poverty line to an empowerment line. What's the difference? We've all become accustomed to the poverty line, which effectively says, how do you get somebody to ensure that they can survive? right? Empowerment goes beyond that. Empowerment says it's not about survival. What it's about is it's about mobility, social mobility. It's about saying, do you have a shot? So this is a line that ensures that people have basic access to infrastructure, to education, to health, to being able to be resilient. It's the minimum level that says, I have a shot. So we've defined this notion of the real aspiration should not be rising above the poverty line, it should be rising above the empowerment line. So that's the aspirational side. The challenge is 60% of the world today does not meet this standard. And when you look at specific countries, let's take India, 75% are below the empowerment line. In places like Mexico, Brazil, and China, 50% are below the empowerment line. And even in the most advanced economies, 25% are below the empowerment line. So when we raise our aspiration from poverty to empowerment, we raise the challenge. So we then did some research to say how much investment is required to solve two key pillars, to raise everybody to the empowerment line and to solve the world's net zero equation. What's the investment required? Well, the investment required is massive. Right? When you look at this on a global basis, it's $37 trillion to raise everybody to the empowerment line. It's a further $41 trillion to solve the net zero equation, which gives us a massive number of $78 trillion. The G20, which we're focused on today, plays the lion's share of that role. That's $56 trillion. Okay, so it's a big number to solve this problem. How do we actually drive enough economic growth to solve this? Where's the money going to come from? This is the second big observation. And I'll go to good news and bad news. The good news is we believe half of this gap can be solved. We have a pathway to it, and it's really driven on two things. How do we create an environment to drive economic growth, which can solve about 13 trillion of this equation? And further, line of sight innovations. These are not unknown innovations, but innovations that we know today can solve another 16 trillion. That closes half the gap. If we can create an environment that fosters economic growth and fosters innovation, we can close half the gap. The problem is we have another half to still close. And for this, we need to get creative. And we started to then do some research to say, how do we get creative? And the key to getting creative is starting by looking around the world today for pockets of innovation and figuring out how can we level up in these pockets of innovation. So let's look at these pockets of innovation. The first pocket of innovation deals with access and skilling. Right? If we can create more access and skilling. Let me give you two examples. On access, Mexico. Mexico has played a leading role to create trade access, not just with the US, but for countries around the world. And when you look at the economic growth of Mexico and foreign direct investment has gone up 50% in the last year alone as the world has reimagined supply chains due to its open trade policy with the rest of the world. Access has driven economic growth. Access. If we think about upskilling, I'd look at Germany as an example, and the work they have focused on apprenticeship programs for trade skills for 16-year-olds and up have led the way for the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. Access and skilling, maybe one source of innovation that we could level up in. Let's go to housing. Affordable housing becomes another beacon of light to solve this particular equation. And I start with Brazil. The program Minha Casa Minha Vida, right, has been recognized by the UN as a global lighthouse for providing creative financing to drive low-income housing across Brazil. In Indonesia cooperated with the World Bank to renovate over 250,000 low-income houses. There are examples of this that we could radiate out to provide affordable housing for all. Let's turn to healthcare. Here in India alone, the Apollo's end-to-end approach to looking at data across the value chain has unlocked massive opportunities for outcomes-based health. Data across value chains. If we can drive more data exchange in health, there's massive opportunity for access for all. If I go to nutrition and we look at China, China's Green for Grain program, which really tackled the issues of technical assistance to deal with afforestation and erosion. Focused in working with farmers, the results of those programs dropped reduced soil erosion and reduced water use by 71%. This affected 8 million hectares. There is an opportunity here around a revolution through agriculture and to drive nutrition. And finally, I'll go to the UK for schooling. UK has been chronically short of teachers. And by tackling this problem from the mundane, online applications to teachers, to also looking at the more complicated, balancing workloads, changing pay, they've doubled the number of applicants. From 2019, there were 2,800 applicants for teaching. Last year, there were 50,000. You can solve this question of the teacher shortage. All of these examples exist today. None are scaled around the world. So our first observation in solving the rest of the gap is let's learn from each other. Let's learn from each other. Our research concludes with 3 simple ideas. The first is let's not wait to identify the rest of the gap before we get started. Let's move now. Closing half the gap in the rate of speed will drive further innovation that we can't see today. The second is we need to accelerate the adoption of technology. We did some work recently on the value of implementing generative AI, but we got very granular. We looked at 67 use cases across 11 industry verticals. That shows there's an additional $4 trillion of revenues every year for business if they adopt generative AI capabilities. If we accelerate generative AI through reskilling, we'll actually solve a massive chunk of this residual gap. And finally, as Mr. Kant talked about, there are financial challenges. We need to actually solve new financial instruments to make this happen. And 2 days ago, I was very excited. Brazil launched $2 billion US of sovereign bonds focused on sustainability, one of the first in the world. If that can be a lighthouse to do more to unlock financial flows from north to south, we have a shot at closing the residual gap. So let me then close with, is it all worth it? Is it all worth it? What could the world look like if we do solve this simultaneous equation of growth that is both inclusive and sustainable? Well, a few ideas just to excite us. The first is we could guarantee moving from survival to the notion that everyone has a shot. Everyone has a shot to be mobile in life. The second, we can build resilience into our system, that one bad decision doesn't permanently change the course of your life, that you can withstand an exogenous event or you can withstand one bad decision. The world would be more resilient. Third, the world would be more connected. And I think in particular today, when the world is pulling itself apart, a more connected world versus a more divided world is a healthier world. Fourth, on the idea of healthcare, there's equity and access for all that ensures we all can thrive. Next, empowerment. If we actually get to the empowerment line, everyone has the ability to participate in their communities. No voice goes unheard. And finally, on the environment, there's secure, clean, and affordable energy for all. So I think we can all agree this is the kind of world that we'd like to have. That's the conclusion of our report. And as I wrap up, I would love to proactively thank our hosts, Sonia and Vishnu, and Mr. Kant. Again, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful collaboration. Thank you all.